record button, and I think we are live.
Excellent. Good evening. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad that you
Okay, hi.
generously and enthusiastically to what was certainly a last-minute invitation. Like the idea behind the invitation hasn't been bubbling up, but it has been over the past number of weeks a little bit hard to draw a breath deep enough to know exactly what to say or how to respond, how to be in public, in the world. You'll get a chance to see and hear more about me and my disposition about things, about my illness and treatment, and about what it means to have life framed in a somewhat different way. And I urge you also to call me about it, personally, to call me about it. I will give you my cell phone, or ask Jenna to just put it up there. Can you put it in the chat?
I can.
Okay. And the reason that I ask you to do that is because I apologize for people who've heard me say this before or say the like of it before. But if you're imagining a conversation with me about what it's like to be at this particular reflective turn in a life, and you're grafting that onto your own voice, then you're not hearing my voice. My voice is not the one you're carrying around. It's your voice, whatever those, and it will be at least in part your voice in any event, because there's a collation of voices, a collocation of voices that we all carry around. Some of them belong more authentically to us or are more deeply embedded, and some of them less so. But if you want to talk to me about how I'm feeling about my frame of existence, then call me at the number that's posted and send 2 box tops from your favorite Battle Creek, Michigan cereal, and 1 quarter too. No, just call me, because, well, you know, we are a community after all. We deserve the ability, we deserve to take the time to think through these things, to think through them together, to evaluate the ways in which we walk together, we continue to do things together. That is, to me, extremely important. And now I feel like I have drawn a breath deep enough to actually make a start. So let me say this. Today is my birthday. Today is my 69th birthday. Tomorrow is my father's birthday. And yes, we have long followed each other, one upon the other. He died back in 2005. Yet our birthdays somehow still seem to be nipping at each other's heels. And it's interesting to see as I get older and develop, season, age in the ways that I do, how much I see my father in me in ways that I never really thought that I would or could or should or even wanted to in some cases. And in some cases, just the opposite. I'm thrilled and pleased that he is hanging around and still informs the kinds of things that I do and that I think about. So this is, I say, not a new sentiment to have this kind of gathering, but the deep breath is really necessary. And so I'm happy to make what is really a beginning this evening. And we'll try to develop a schedule for these kinds of events. I think they'll largely be around poetry, because that seems like a good chronicle. It's a good way of taking the soul print, as it were, of a teacher and a community, to see how it is that we respond to the very dense, pared down voices that bring us, in the language of religious imagination, the kinds of stories that infuse us, that continue to stay with us, that are always, always a part of us. And as you know, one of my heroes to this end is Yehuda Amichai. He's a modern hero who continues the conversation from the most ancient worlds that we inhabit, the worlds that, not of the biblical text per se, although that's at the root of it, but the rabbinic texts and those teachers who take the stories very seriously and want to see themselves in the stories and see the stories in themselves and have an impossible time separating out one from the other. which is exactly right. It is exactly the right difficulty to have. If all you have is the written text, then you don't have very much. The written text is a Reader's Digest version in a certain way. It is a Folger's freeze-dried experience, you know? You need to add your own water to it, your own tears to it, your own life to it, your own father to it, as Amichai does right at the beginning of this poem. Once you have done that, you have claimed the story in a fuller way. Let's see how Amichai accomplishes this, or how it is that he sets out challenging us. And along the way, I'll tell you a story of my first passage translating this in days much more pious and less understanding. But here's how Amichai begins. My father was God and did not know it. How stunning is that? I know your hand followed your eyes followed my hand up to my head, and maybe you'll see that Sabina gave me a haircut. I'm just saying that I don't know whether you're in need of a haircut yourself, but if you trust Sabina and we can figure out the distancing thing properly, maybe we can work something out. My father was God and did not know it. He gave me the 10 commandments, neither in thunder nor in fury, neither in fire nor in cloud, but in gentleness and in love. He added caresses and added kind words, adding, I beg you, and please. He sang, keep and remember in a single melody, and he pleaded and cried quietly between one commandment and the next. Don't take your God's name in vain. Don't take it. Not in vain. I beg you, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. He hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. And he put the palms of his open hands on my head with the Yom Kippur blessing. Honor, love, in order that your days might be long on the earth. And my father's voice was white like the hair on his head. Later, he turned his face to me one last time, like on the day he died in my arms, and said, I want to add 2 to the 10 commandments. The 11th commandment, don't change. The 12th commandment, you must surely change. So said my father, and then he turned from me and went off, disappearing into his strange distances. Once upon a time, I translated the first line of this poem as follows. My father was a god and did not know it. Stopping short of saying what I know deeply that the poet wanted to say. Not my father was a god, like my father was in the pantheon, like my father was the one who held onto the seat of my bicycle and ran like the wind while stabilizing me until such time as he could feel in his hand that I could negotiate this on my own. And in front of the Birch's house on Dodson Lane, he actually let me go and I sailed on. Not my father was a god, not my father was an Olympian, not my father could jump over fences in a single bound to retrieve my errant throw that was supposed to be a curveball but had gone disturbingly awry. None of that stuff, not a god, but my father was God. That's what the poet wants to say. It's the only way in which the poem makes sense. Not the pious pulling of the punch, my father was a god, but my father was God and did not know it. He gave me the 10 Commandments. The poet knows the story. This is the wonderful conspiracy of reader and text. The poet knows the story, and maybe in a certain sense we could say the story knows the poet, or the possible turns that the poet would take. The poet certainly knows the story and is relying on you to know the story. He gave me the 10 Commandments neither in thunder nor in fury, neither in fire nor in cloud. Where is the poet getting that information? What's his source? It's the Torah story. It's the Torah story itself. We all know that, and it's against that backdrop that we are able to read and hear the poem with that kind of conspiratorial tone. That conspiracy means to breathe together, right? The con is together and spire is to breathe. A conspiracy is when we breathe together. This poem is, you can hear the voices, the inhaling and the exhaling of the Bible text and of the poet himself, perhaps. And these voices are conspiring towards some kind of meaning, some kind of special meaning. He gave me the 10 Commandments, and he didn't do it according to the way in which it says it on Mount Sinai. Is the poet rewriting the story of Mount Sinai? No, he's not, because he knows that you know the story of Mount Sinai, and to try to rewrite it would in a certain way undermine his credibility as a bearer of the text. That's not his point. His point is that when my father gave me the Torah, which is the definitive place from which I got Torah, that was God. That was really it. What's the Sinai before which you stand? I mean, you as an individual, we as individuals. It's extraordinary. We have a collective story, and the poet bows to the collective story, but he says, it's not the way I personally experienced it. Not in fury, neither in fire nor in cloud, unlike the Exodus story, but in gentleness and in love. He added caresses and added kind words, adding, I beg you, and please. This is his Father. This is his God. This is his Sinai. Please, would it make a difference to you as an individual to hear a Sinai commandment voiced in the voice of father or mother or teacher or somebody, along with, please, do this. Do this for our sake. Do it for my sake. Don't do this. It's not nice. It's not how people ought to behave. Don't do it. How would that affect the way in which you or I understand the story of the commandments and Photoshop our own personal story onto Mount Sinai? There's affect that's added here. There are words that are added here. But then the poet goes right back to the story as it's told in the Bible itself, in the italics. Don't take your God's name in vain, now non-italics. Don't take it, not in vain. A way of infusing some meaning in the italicized or some affect into the italicized words, wouldn't you say? Not like Charlton Heston. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. But don't take your God's name in vain. Don't do it. It's too precious for that. It's too encumbered for that. Don't take it, not in vain. I beg you, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. No, not that. I beg you, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. He's trying here to give us, with the italicized Bible text, and his glosses on it, a way of having both the text and also an emotional framework, which is his own emotional framework. He hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear. Now Sinai set aside entirely, we could say. Don't steal, but now it's back. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. And now at the pinnacle of this revelation, he put the palms of his open hands on my head with the Yom Kippur blessing. There is no Yom Kippur blessing per se. There is a sequence that takes, that allows for parents to say, just like on Shabbat, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and so on. But Amichai is identifying it as a Yom Kippur blessing. But I tell you this, lest we think that there's a special blessing that he knows and of which we are unaware. Perhaps his father gave him a two-handed blessing on this day. And on Yom Kippur, the text of the Ten Commandments, once again, honor, love, in order that your days might be long on the earth. And my father's voice was white, like the hair on his head. What an image. Those of us with white hair who are looking more and more like our fathers, perhaps, or me with my white hair looking more and more like my father, take this very seriously. What does it mean to have that synesthetic thing going, the voice and the color and the affect, the sound, the appearance, to have all of that going? Later, he turned his face to me one last time, like on the day he died in my arms, and said, I want to add 2 to the 10 Commandments. It sounds like there's a later. He has taught his son the 10 Commandments in his own way, after his own fashion, in his own image, with his own affect. But sometime later, on further reflection, there's another piece. There's an epilogue, a brace of commandments. 2 more that he would like to add. Hadiber ha'echad asar. The 11th commandment. Lo tishtaneh. Lo tishtaneh. Don't change. V'hadiber hashnem asar. And the 12th one. Tishtaneh, tishtaneh. You will certainly change. Imitating here so perfectly the biblical, or duplicating the biblical idiom, thou shalt surely, a repetition of the verb, an emphasis of the verb, shana, which gives us the word year. But tishtaneh means change. The 11th commandment, lo tishtaneh, ma nishtana halayla hazeh. You hear it there also. Lo tishtaneh, don't change. Boychik, don't change. But then comes the next commandment. Tishtaneh, tishtaneh, in the biblical idiom. You must certainly change. And there's the tension. It's a tension between a father and a father, a mother and a mother, parents and children, between us, fellow travelers. You want things to change. You don't want things to change. Here's the 11th commandment and the 12th commandment. Oh, it was enough. 10 was enough. 10 was a good number. But Amichai won't let me be. There's an 11th and there's a 12th. So said my father, and then he turned from me and went off, disappearing into his strange distances. Kach amar avi. So did my father say, ufana mimeni, and turned from me, v'halach. The end of the last line, the end of the second to the last line in the Hebrew. And he went, v'ne'elam b'merchakav hamuzarim, disappearing into his strange distances. Well, there's his poem and almost a half an hour monologue by me. I wonder whether you would like to participate. There's plenty more to say about it. But I'm wondering whether, yes, Errol, let's see.
Yeah.
Oh,
In your description of the relationship between the father and the son, it immediately brought to mind the Haggadah. You shall tell your children on that day. In other words, it's a parallel as far as I'm concerned.
thank you. You shall tell your children on that day. What's the day? What do you tell your children? How many days? How many messages? How is it framed each time with each holiday or each occurrence? The stories keep flowing together. We're going to get back to that, but you shall tell your child on that day. Either the holiday or maybe the day on which he decides to give you the Torah, or the day on which you realize that you have gotten the Torah from that parent or that teacher or that mentor or that model. What's the day when you finally recognize that, oh, that's the Torah that I got from so on, retroactively, as though it came from on high, learning it with all of its mystery and magic. Hal.
Yeah, when Passover comes, we're supposed to celebrate it as if we were there. Is there any kind of thing around the Ten Commandments that when we hear it as if we were there, or it's not? And then in which case it has to be transmitted to us differently?
Well, there are stories. Yeah. How do we feel about absolute direct transmission? We love our traditions. We love our history. But you know what? We trust our own ears and our own voices just a little bit more than that. So you will find lots of extraordinary, beautiful, biblical, or rather midrashic tales, rabbinic tales about the people of Israel standing at the base of Mount Sinai and actually hearing God as an individual. Almost as though Amichai is taking his place among the individuals who are standing at Sinai. And on what did the rabbis hang this extraordinary weight of their rabbinic, of their imagination? Everybody hears God as though standing at Mount Sinai. Well, because it says, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God, not y'all's God. A differentiation that you can make in Hebrew that you can't make in English. Anochi Adonai Elohecha, asher hotzeticha me'eretz Misraim. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You? Oh, wait. You mean me? Yes, I mean you. And a further rabbinic legend which says, just like that wondrous Roman statuary, which is all around us, back in the days when that statuary still had eyes in the eye sockets, those eyes seemed to follow you Mona Lisa-like all around the room. And the Midrash says, no matter where you're standing in the room, it looks as though, and you might say, that statue's looking right at me, right at me, right at me, right at me. I swear, right at me, following me around the room. And the rabbis say the same thing about God at Mount Sinai in the second person singular address. Yes, right to me. It's me. So it's an authentic voice, and it's coming to me from on high, or from inside. Lots more stories, but we are dedicated both to hearing the text and also to hearing the inner voice that stands inside the text or at the heart of it. Where else are we going here?
Had a hand up, but I don't see
I saw a Fisher hand.
There's a Fisher hand.
Am I muted? Okay. Hi.
And
I'm struck by the ending when he says later his dad turned his face to me one last time, like on the day he died. And then his father disappeared into his strange distances in the plural. Can you say more about that? Because I'm thinking he didn't die multiple times. He died once, but maybe he talked about the 11th and 12th commandments more than once, or maybe he imagines his father's going to multiple places. What more can you share about that?
I know where it is. His strange distances. I just want to start there. How long does God stay at Sinai? And what did God do after the revelation? It's not long. I'm seeing Melanie mouthing that. Yeah, not long. God comes, gives the Torah, boom, off wherever. So where does God disappear?
More like
Hakav hamuzarim.
Does
When his father finishes his revelation or his staggered revelation, then what happens? He closes his eyes one more time. And if one death was a rehearsal and the next death was not, then he closes his eyes one more time and he disappears from his and goes to his strange distances, a place from which he will not return. God doesn't come back to Mount Sinai. Does God come back to the people of Israel? Don't want to make this into a drasha, you know. Sure, but what is it that preserves the relationship? Part of what preserves that Sinai relationship is our retelling of the story and revitalizing of the story. So I'm in some ways doing the story a disservice if God doesn't look like my mother or my father or one of my, you know, or any of my great teachers or any of yours. So yeah, rehearsals for dying, what Phil Oakes called in an extraordinary song. Oh, Phil Oakes! I haven't thought about Phil Oakes in a really long time. How about you? But, a song called Rehearsal for Retirement. I want to say, at least that was a major motif of the song. Actually dying, almost dying, dying to the revelation, as it were, or to the original 10, coming back. Thanks. Well, actually, no, I don't wish that I had anything more definitive to say. I like the sloppiness of what I was saying. It's good. It's good to like. Yes, Hamburgs. And Susan, and then Melanie.
So I'm really struck, Steve, about how you framed the beginning of this conversation about how you thought about yourself in the image of your father. And I'm here to say that you're in the image of both your mother and your father. and so trying not to be so gender specific, but to take the issue of you being in the image of your parents. I think that this, how Amihai presents this as how a parent then relates all of this sense of morality, the sense of ethical behavior, the sense of fairness, the sense of being, and being in the world as a whole human being. That the parents do this. And why I'm also struck more by that, I think, is that every parent goes, don't change. This is like a perfect moment. Do not change. But yet, on the other hand, what we are doing with our children every single day, up to today, up to this moment, is we're encouraging them to change. We're supporting them changing. And I think that I think when you talk about your parents, or I talk about my parents, they always want to know what tomorrow's going to be. What's tomorrow? And I think Amachai really, by just including these distances and this change and don't change, is a beautiful way of capturing a parent's sense of joy, a parent's sense of sadness, a parent's sense of pride, what our job is as parents.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Certainly more to say about it, and we will come back to it. But Susan, I don't want to overlook you, and then Melanie. Susan, I don't see you at the moment. But...
I'm here.
Okay.
Unmuted. Yes. Well, it's kind of following on what was said about my father was God and didn't know it. I mean, I was struck by the image of a child seeing his or her father as God, and I think that's really not all that uncommon if you're brought up in a monotheistic religion, that we speak of God as Father, and when you're young, the first authorities you know is your father, who teaches you and guides you and gives you commandments and also cares for you.
Yeah, thank you. So very much within a larger religious tradition where we're almost tuned into that, or we are tuned into it, God and Father. Thank you. Melanie.
I guess I sort of see this poem as not being all in one time, but sort of in a story. And, you know, when you're a kid and your parents are the gods, you know, they say whatever it is you're going to do or not do, or give you whatever you're going to get or not get. And as Susan said, I think that's a very common thing. But what he says, he gives, you know, your parents give you the rules to live, the 10 Commandments, but, you know, here his father is giving him or showing him the way he wants him to live, gently, begging him, pleading with him, not scaring him or making him fear the fire or the brimstone or whatever other Cecil B. DeMille visions that we have filled our heads about who God is or who God isn't, or all of the new movies that, you know, the later movies that talk about God as George Burns, you know, I mean, we have lots of images of who God is, and, you know, the Coen brothers God and everything, you know, but you get older and you move through it, and here's this father saying, you know, be a good person. Yeah. And then he comes to the thing, you know, around Yom Kippur, and he said, and then that your days may be long on earth. And he says, you know, I want you to be a good person because otherwise you're not going to make it. You know, something bad's going to happen to you. Right. And then at the end of his life, he sits there and he says, you know, one last time, you know what? I actually want to be God. I actually want to tell you something. I want to tell you, don't change. He says, but you got to change. And so that's his father's last godlike thing. But when I look at this as a father and a son, this reflects a really good relationship between a father and a son. There are many people, including myself, who did not have parents who paid that much attention to me. You know, they were very absorbed in other things. So here is the quintessential, wonderful child, parent kind of parable of either what you want your father to have said to you or what you think father should send it to you. And it's, so it gives everybody the same gift. At the end, he says, you know, change, you know, and then he goes, too bad, you got it.
Here's a story about, of unfolding dynamic revelation. Thank you, Melanie, and Susan, and also Stacy. I mean, so you can sort of string together these your comments, maybe anchoring in the fact that God, Father. Okay, we're used to hearing that in the religious vocabulary of our world, of our larger world. But is it a moment, or is it a dynamic unfolding of a revelation over a long period of time, over a lifetime? And maybe even I thought it was over already, but it wasn't over. Yeah. Because all I had gotten, or what I had gotten, was the essential stuff from which my life ought to be knit. But there's even more, because when my father became very reflective, and I say father here just following the narrative line of the poem and the usage of the poet, he captured this dynamic, this ambivalence, or one of my friends says ambivalence, or to be ambivalent, is much too passive. We need to be able to say, I'm ambivalating. I don't think that's a real word, but it ought to be. Yeah. As father, here's this father who's ambivalating here. I really don't want you to change. And then of course I really do want you to change. And it's dynamic. And what's at stake? Everything is at stake. Let's say if we're talking the language of Exodus chapter 19 and 20, and somehow photoshopping in this wonderful midrashic way, both the shot of that text, which is to say the plain meaning of that text, which is you're now getting a set of rules by which you can live, and at the same time move it away from that mountain to another mountain. Where's the mountain where your beloved teacher actually gave you the Torah? Or how do you collect all of those Torahs that you have been given into one mountain scene and cast it as the great story of Revelation, or as a great story?
Steve, do you think that those last change and don't change are his personal words to his son? Like, I'm giving you the word of God, but this is my secret of life. Don't change. You got to change.
I think it's the parent.
This is it.
I think it's the parent, but if I wanted to make the case that it was also God, I think I could do that. There's plenty of times, there's plenty of stories, plenty of biblical stories where God says, you really ought to change. You really ought to follow the ways of other people and appoint for yourself a king, let's say, and then at the same time say, you better not appoint a king because that king would be taking my place, and we don't want that to happen. So we could also tell this in terms of the biblical story, but I think it's the father. He's imagining his father in one last great moment of revelation, or at least he's hearing it at the end, maybe, of his father's life. Isaac.
Yeah, I find it really timely in that you look at your father and you look at the communication to you when you're young, let's say, of the Ten Commandments and your perspective of them from a very young age. And although you're given it from on high, parental, God, what have you, you have to take it in and perceive it and react upon it. And sometimes through hubris, and as you get older, you may not have all the understanding, and though you know the commandment and the rules, you fudge, you cut corners, what have you. And now we have an idea of that things you want to be the same, but things are always going to change.
Yeah.
And very timely right now, we all would like things to be the same or as we've known them. But I think we're probably going to have to get used to a lot of change. Look, just how we dive in now that we're accepting this medium, this platform as an acceptable form of having our minyan. And I'm going to give a spoiler. If anyone ever saw the movie Contact with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, where they're supposedly communicated information from an alien form and they build a device to connect, and Jodie Foster goes, and when she meets what is to be an alien, it takes the form of her deceased father. And she says, she's a physicist, and she says, why did you approach me in this manner? And the alien intelligence said, we're presenting it to you in the manner that you are able to understand at this point in time. And as you grow, you will take an understanding, accept more. And I personally have been getting very, very philosophical since the pandemic and all the other domino effects that come from this pandemic on our whole society and economy and what have you.
Yes.
And I wonder if our ignoring of commandments and things and tikkun olam and things that are so inherent to who we are as the Jewish people, and maybe we're being taught a lesson in a manner we can finally understand it.
Well, I would say we're always being taught lessons. It's a question of whether we're ready to learn them. Thanks for that, Judith. I think I ignored you. I saw your hand several screens back, and Elizabeth and
Dory.
and Rosenstein. Okay, well, okay, yeah, Judith. All right, Elizabeth.
Oh, I was muted. I'm sorry. I was
muted. All right, let's go back.
I'm sorry.
We'll go back.
I was muted. First of all, happy birthday.
Thank you.
Second of all, I wanted to relate what you said about how a lot of us are surprised that our parents who have passed on continue to surprise us by their presence. And I wanted to relate that to the first line of the poem, which I couldn't help but think of the verse, God was in this place, but I did not know it. You know, my father was a God and he didn't know it. And I guess what I'm thinking is God was in this place and that the place is the poet, the speaker, or me, or you, or any of us. God was here. Our Father was here. We didn't know it at the time, but he was here. We know it now. And we are also gods, as it were, to our children, and they will be discovering our presence probably after we're gone as well. So I guess that's it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. What's the Sinai that you stood before? I'll just question in a somewhat different fashion. What's the Sinai before which you stood, or what are the Sinais before which you stood that you collected, from which you collected these basic principles of how you should live your life, such that you can now hear them all in one verse, as it were, in one story that is so tightly fused together that you can't distinguish between the ancient text and the modern text. It's the same story. And one event, or was it many events?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. While I'm thinking about it, we passed right over it. But you know, there are two versions of the commandment for the Sabbath, for keeping the Sabbath. One of them is Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. Remember the other one says Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. Keep the Sabbath day. The first one is in Exodus. The second one is in Deuteronomy. And rabbis are oftentimes hard pressed to figure out why there are two different witnesses. Did Moses remember it differently when he wrote Deuteronomy? Was there something imperfect about the memory that is supposed to, you know, in these philosophical, almost Aristotelian ways, carry the story of Revelation and its documentation? They have to be pristine. They have to be right. They all have to be the same. Why would Moses use a different phrase here or there? And one of the most glorious midrashim that we have on this whole issue is the midrash that God spoke both of these words at the same time. How else could you figure out a way of affirming both words as being true? God said, Shamor, keep, and Zachor, remember. And along came Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz and captured this in verse, Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala, and so on. Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad. He said them both in one utterance. B'dibur. which means an utterance. It's also a word. It's also the word for commandment, aseret hadibrot. And Amichai uses the word, if you investigate the Hebrew, you'll see that he uses the word diber, which means dictum or command. That's the way he uses them. But when he speaks here about the Sabbath, and he, excuse me, it's not when he speaks about the Sabbath. Where is it that he says, keep and remember? No, it is the Sabbath. Yeah. In gentleness and in love, he added caresses and kind words, adding, I beg you, and please. He sang Shamor v'Zachor to a single melody. That's really what he's talking about. He's talking to you and me about the way in which we sing this Friday night hymn. That's exactly it. So if you feel like you're being bombarded from all parts of Jewish history, it is in fact the case. So, Elizabeth.
I'm going to bring it maybe more less philosophical, Isaac, to more like a practical thought, which is like because I was a single mom for a long time, so I was a mother-father. And I think about the way like I taught my daughter Torah, and I made up a song and I used to say, we're following the rabbi, the rabbi, the rabbi, following the rabbi, wherever he will go. And then I had another line about how he's teaching us the Torah and he's teaching us what's good for us. And so when we walked into temple, we'd be singing this little song, and it was like my way of bringing Torah to her. And then the rabbi, gave her Torah that I couldn't probably give her, but I surrounded her with it in a way that it became who she is today and why she probably made Aliyah. And, because she saw Judaism as everything. The Torah was everywhere around her. Everything we did, we'd look at clouds and talk about how, Hashem brought us clouds. Yeah. So I think that's part of what he's kind of saying in the beginning. But I thought the end was really telling when he said, like, don't change, but you will. Because I think that's how, like, every parent looks at their child and it's like, don't change, be full of wonderment, believe me, believe in the Torah, believe the world is always good. It's the tree of life that all who hold on to will be healthy and perfect. But we know that they will change as the seasons turn, and they'll question, is that what gives them it? They'll face death, they'll face breakups, they'll, turn out changing who they are. And so I thought it was like the father looking, saying, like, don't change. And then, like, taking a breath back, being like, but you will, but in the sense, remember who you were when you were young and plentiful of the world being perfect. So I guess I saw it a little different.
Thank you. Preserving the tension. Absolutely. Preserving the tension. Yeah, Dory.
My question is, how old was the narrator when he was receiving his father's wisdom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the answer to it. It's a question that I want to say he was in his 30s when his father died, actually. So over what period of time, as he recollects his life in the presence of his father, this particular Sinai person in his life, over what period of time is he collecting it? It would be an interesting question to ask him. What's the first little bit of Torah that you got? Yeah. What's the first little bit? The story requires the integrity of a narrative, requires the integrity of the biblical story. We need Exodus chapter 20 to hold all of this stuff together. We got in our own little containers, our own little six packs, we got enough adrenaline or enough caffeine or enough alcohol. We got enough of that to keep ourselves fueled as individuals. But our own six pack requires that little plastic thing on the top that holds them all together, That's the narrative structure. That's the narrative structure of the story. If we don't have the narrative structure of the story, all of this falls into, well, what did you learn from your father and when did you learn it? Yeah, there's something, I want to say, meta than that. Anything you can do, I can do meta, right? Let's say. There's something even meta than that, which is the story that we all tell about ourselves, not as individuals, but as a collective a collection of cells. Didn't have a good relationship with your mother, didn't have a good relationship with your father. There was abuse there. There was neglect. There was disappointment. I could run right upstairs now and get you and show you, or I could fake it and hold up some other book, but I won't. I have upstairs a little, you know, those cute little fancy looking, like you got important things to say, moleskin small diaries that are, the last time I went to visit my father, I bought such a diary. And I remember sitting at the airport, going down to see him and writing in it. One of my tasks in going down to see my father was to tell him that Ariel was pregnant with her first child. Another one was to help him deal with some medical issues at the end of his life. He lived out his life with Parkinson's in Sarasota, Florida. To help him deal with some stuff, to tell him that his granddaughter was going to have a baby, and to deal with what was very clearly a transition. And I started this journal that I kept for an entire year, and then I had to figure out whether to keep it going or not. And I did for just a little bit, but not so much. But a lot of this is really punishing. You know, a lot of it pays attention to disappointments with my father that are real and impressionable and deep and porous, and at the same time, there's a lot of Torah there. So if I were to rewrite, I'm now in a better position to tell an Amichai kind of story, my own version of what it meant to stand in front of Sinai. But, you know, I have one written text in which I personally attested to how crummy this was, or how ill-considered that was, or how ill-tempered or untimely, and so on. All true. And also the other story, I believe. Orit.
Thank you.
And Harold?
Yom Huledet Sameach, first of all.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for this poem. It was a gift to me. As you know, my dad slowly fading for the last couple of years, but he's 90 now and his health is deteriorating. And when I saw the poem, I started crying like a baby almost, which doesn't happen to me often when I read something. And suddenly I started asking myself, and everything made sense. I realized what my father is to me and what I'm going through. And I started thinking about stories and moments, and it was that the poem was describing what I'm trying to understand, what it means. And then when I got to the part of change, and my father many times said, don't change. That's something that he says very often. But he always said that I need to know how to distinguish between what I can change and what I can't. Because I always try to solve things and to change things really. And I understand at the same time that change is evolution. So we can't not change, because change is natural. We constantly are evolving and changing. Wow. And I understand that message that my roots will never change. And that's the God that he is, and that's the commandment. But then I will keep evolving with everything that he gave me. So
thank you.
I want to thank you again.
Oh, you're very welcome, and I'm honored. Take the poem, tuck it into your siddur. Yeah, allow it to be part of your own personal story. You've made it your own personal story. There were some other hands to be. Harold?
Yeah.
Oh, Rosenstein, there you are.
I'll jump in. Yeah, you have to speak to be seen. That in itself was interesting. Yeah, I was thinking again, I think got so many things in this conversation. Strange distances, you know, our distance from Sinai, but the fact that it's plural reminded me of the idea that God is described as having faces, punim, and not a face. And these distances are also part of the facets, perhaps, of God. and that sometimes God is on Sinai and you're there in front of the mountain, and sometimes God is your father and that's his face, and you're there or he's in your arms. And this gets back to the idea of change, that, don't change. God is what he is and he's unchangeable. And yet he has these faces, and he's here and he's there. And these words, like you said, the quotes, Moses heard that, but it changes, and it can change in a single melody. And I guess it's just a much more interesting way to think about it. So how did we all hear this from Sinai? I don't remember being at Sinai and hearing this, but maybe this is the way we heard it. And also what Elizabeth was saying about her daughter, she didn't hear exactly those words, but she understood that message, and she taught it diligently to her child, and it got through. So those strange distances are what this poem is all about.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm very much with you, and there's more to say about it, but my eye is grabbed by various screen features that I don't know how to discern.
I am sorry that we can't see all the hands go up and know who's asking. So please just
Rosenstein.
holler if you have something.
But unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay, you got me?
Yeah.
Okay, I love this poem. It has so many facets. And from my father to me, from me to my kids. And it's like, okay, Debbie, you know all this stuff. You've been taught the 10 Commandments, how to live, how to move in the world, and you get it. So don't change. But because you know all this stuff, now you have to change. You have to move with the world. You have to keep going forward. And that's the one thing about this poem that I absolutely adore, the 11th and 12th commandments. Get on.
Excellent.
And it's good for me as part of the poem, and it surrounds me with what's going on right now. I love it. It's perfect.
Sinai, yes, in terms of Jewish sacred language, Sinai is at stake here. Every single time you the integrity of that story is at stake. There's another Torah that you're learning, or you have to, or you're invited to merge it with Torah that you've already learned. The expanding Sinai.
Hey.
Yeah.
So I had a thought, not to jump out of order, what the order is. So,
well, you're a rabbi.
Well, it's what they call me some of these days, but kavod harav. Hishtaneh tishtaneh, that thou shalt surely change. One of our teachers at RRC, the biblicist, Dr. Michael Karasik, once told us that doubling of a word grammatically like that is in some ways the Tanakh's way of using a 4-letter word. It's a severity, and it's extreme, and it's frustrated. And I feel like against the backdrop of this, it's not always pretty, and it's not always perfect. And sometimes Dad didn't always get it right, or sometimes the God that we experience is a jealous or zealous God in point of fact. But I guess I hear in this a piece of what reverberates for me is that it's frustrating. It's frustrating both to be the dad sometimes, and it's frustrating dealing with dads sometimes, and it's frustrating, I don't know, to wonder, where is the Kadosh Baruch Hu in all of this? And maybe God is a frustrated God sometimes too.
Excellent, thank you. And thanks for opening me up to a new way of reading that emphatic, that doubling of the verb as an expletive. Because why not? I know that it's an emphatic, and yet my voicing of the emphatic still takes on that Cecil B. DeMille quality. And it doesn't have to. And I'd sort of rather that it didn't. So thank you for helping me break through the story. Is there somebody whom we've ignored? Yes, Sue.
Well, first of all, I'm going in my own private space to read this as Bobby McFerrin sings Psalm 23. I won't do it in front of everybody, but the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. She maketh me lie down in green waters. And so I think of this as, as Elizabeth said before, I think this is father, mother. It's whatever we want this to be. For me, maybe not for everybody, but for me. So I'm going to read it to myself as she gave me the 10 Commandments, neither in thunder or in fury, just to see if it feels different, So, and
Yeah.
I think it will, and it has it's a different viewpoint, and a different heart to it too. The other thing that I love about this poem is how these are the biblical words, and they're woven into the story like they fit, and it may be that when the commandments were taught that it wasn't in thunder or fury. So the child maybe didn't even know that a commandment was being taught, but it was woven in, which is kind of a beautiful thing. And I think it's the way we'd like to live our lives, that we live by the commandments, and that's how we pass it on, in the way that we live. I particularly love that he sang "Keep and Remember" in a single melody. I mean, it's all woven together.
Yeah.
And one more thing, and that is that, okay, so there's the 10 Commandments that are here, and they were given and woven in, and like Melanie said, this happens over time. It's not just one time and space.
Right.
And then the humanity of my father or my mother, who is God, is also woven in here too, with gentleness and love and caresses. And the last 2 commandments are really about that person's, my father or my mother or God's humanity.
Yeah.
Because it says, I want you to stay right the way you are right now. You are perfect. I mean, how many parents don't say that about their 15-month-old? Well, I don't remember. It's probably different for every child, they're just so precious. But then, they got to change.
Of course.
And that's just so human. Well, such humanity. So,
yeah.
Okay.
And thank you for doing, I see that the Fishers have raised a hand, and did you say Stacy?
I did.
Okay.
I don't know.
And then I think, so we'll go to the Fishers. I'm going to read the poem one more time after that, and we'll be finished. But before leaving Sue behind, Sue, I want to say that I believe deeply that the poet would welcome and love the gender fluidity of the poem. He, unlike God, can't say 2 words at the same time. He doesn't quite know how to say shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. He uses a narrative structure which takes it within the Bible text for us, but it's our job to take the Bible text someplace. It's our job to nudge it. Don't let it rest with his gender specificity. Don't let it rest with the presumptions that a generation and 10 and 20 have brought to it. Bring something new to it. If you want to see something new that's brought to it, and you want to hear a woman's voice talking about all this stuff, well, we'll do this again, and I'll bring you a woman, another poet who has something to say about these matters, and would have an interesting discussion with Amichai. For the moment, Fishers, you have a hand.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. Hi, Gabi.
Hi. One thing that really struck me about this poem was how it's filled with love. And I wonder if that's part of why getting the 10 Commandments were so special to Amichai, because they were given to him by his father through love. And that's kind of part of what he sees as my father was God, and that loving, compassionate side of God that made it so much more important and impactful to him, because he could see how important it was to his father, and he could take it with him and feel that love and remember of his father, and as Orit was saying, of his roots.
Thank you. This is a God who is a revealer, who is a fashioner, who is a traveling companion, who has affect, who has caresses, who gives a blessing, who listens, and who describes ambivalence. You will not change. Just as definitively, you will change. These are extraordinary features. We must move this beyond the story of just God on Sinai. That's too thin a soup for us. It's fine to do it when we read it in the Torah, and we have all the emotion for it, and we need to preserve the text just as it is, because it ultimately preserves us, as you can see from Amichai's narrative structure, which he requires and we require in order to understand it all. But it's not enough. So let me read the poem one more time, and we'll make an end for now. My father was God and did not know it. He gave me the 10 commandments, neither in thunder nor in fury, neither in fire nor in cloud, but in gentleness and in love. He added caresses and added kind words, adding, I beg you, and please. He sang keep and remember in a single melody. And he pleaded and cried quietly between one diber and the next, between one commandment and the next. I beg you, don't take your God's name in vain. Don't take it, not in vain. I beg you, don't bear false witness against your neighbor. He hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't murder. And he put the palms of his open hands on my head with the Yom Kippur blessing. Honor, love, in order that your days might be long on the earth. And my father's voice was white like the hair on his head. Later, he turned his face to me one last time, like on the day he died in my arms, and said, I want to add 2 to the 10 commandments. The 11th commandment, don't change. The 12th commandment, damn it, you must surely change. So said my father, and then he turned from me and went off, disappearing into his strange distances. God never comes back to Sinai again. We never meet the same way again. God never leaves Sinai, and we meet all the time. And the contexts for the relationships and for the stories and for the narratives are always the same and always different. We'll do more another time. Thank you so much.
Which collection? Somebody asked about where this can be found.
Oh,
Thank you.
Where can this be found? You can find it on the Sikha website. It is in his last. It is in his last book, Open, Closed, Open. This is my translation. That translation by Hannah Bloch and Hannah Kronfeld, you will find in their version of Patuach Sagur Patuach, called in English literally Open, Closed, Open, a direct translation from the original Hebrew. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you,
The
Steve.
last minute, really.
Birthday. Thank you for your birthday present to us.
You're
It wasn't
Great.
cake, but it was the next
Thank
best
you.
thing.
Thank you,
Great
Steve.
pleasure. Thank you.
Steve.
Wait, is Kate coming?
Sweet.
Cake is coming.
It was the sweetest cake.
Yes.
Shkoyach.
Thank
We'll
you.
see- we'll see to you.
We
Thank
will
you.
repeat it until 120.
And right now, it's 8:40.
And please.
From you.